human sacrifice aspect is alive and well in our society. I think.
It really is. It's just dressed up in a different way.
That's not a preacher on a street corner. That's a Hollywood A-lister on camera to millions of people. And for years, they told you he was being dramatic.
That there are big realms of good and evil, and they're slugging it out.
What does the evil side want?
Oh, it wants you.
Now ask yourself who in Hollywood talks like that. And more importantly, who taught them to?
There was something happening here that was bigger than just Jeffrey Epstein.
Over 300 names, flight logs, private jets, blackmail. A network so deep, it didn't just protect one predator, it protected all of them. Epstein, Weinstein, Diddy, and Mark Wahlberg has been warning you about exactly why they keep getting away with it. This is the story nobody has fully connected. Until now. Picture two boys, one from Uvalde, Texas, one from the streets of Dorchester, Boston. Two completely different worlds, two completely different upbringings, and yet somehow, when each of them walked through the doors of Hollywood and got deep enough inside, they started saying the exact same things. Not in whispers, not in code, out loud, on camera, to tens of millions of people, and nobody listened. Mark Wahlberg came up hard. He wasn't handed anything. He scraped his way into this industry from the outside, which meant he arrived with something most industry insiders never had the ability to see it clearly. When you grow up on streets that teach you to identify danger before it shows itself, you develop instincts, and those instincts don't stop working just because someone hands you a film contract. From the moment Wahlberg got deep into Hollywood's machinery, he started seeing patterns that didn't add up. He saw the rooms where cameras never went. He sat in meetings where things were said that never made it to the press. He watched actors who were told to smile when every instinct in their body was telling them to run. He watched projects killed in boardrooms, not because they were bad, but because they were too honest. He watched people who asked the wrong questions suddenly find their careers stalling. He watched people who spoke too loudly get quietly isolated. Their phones stopped ringing, their invitations drying up, and he started to realize that Hollywood wasn't just an industry, it was a system, and systems don't run by accident, they run by design. Now here's the piece that most people gloss right over. Hollywood doesn't hate religion because of some philosophical disagreement about the existence of God. That's not what this is. This is structural. Think about it this way: a person anchored to a genuine moral framework, anchored to something bigger than themselves, is a person with a ceiling on what they'll do, a ceiling on what they'll agree to, a ceiling on what they'll stay silent about. And in an industry built entirely on mutual compromise, mutual access, and mutual secrets, a person with a moral ceiling is the most dangerous person in the building.
I do not deny my faith. That's an even bigger sin.
Mark Wahlberg said that on national television, on the Today Show, and the room didn't applaud. It went quiet, not reverent quiet, uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you everything you need to know about what that room thinks of a man who talks openly about what he believes, because the machine understood something in that moment. This one wasn't going to be owned. Now let's talk about the thing nobody wants to say directly, because this whole story, Epstein, Weinstein, Diddy, it keeps circling the same unanswered question. How does a man run a network from a private island for decades and no one stops him? How does a studio executive assault hundreds of women over 30 years and keep his Oscar campaigns running? How does a music mogul throw parties that law enforcement is actively investigating while still collecting Grammy Awards and appearing at celebrity fundraisers? The answer isn't incompetence. The answer isn't oversight. The answer is protection. Deliberate, structured, systematic protection. And Mark Wahlberg understood the architecture of that protection long before the files were unsealed. Here's how the machine works. And this is important, really sit with this. The system doesn't just reward silence, it builds silence into the structure. You don't need to threaten everyone into keeping secrets if you've engineered a world where telling the truth costs more than keeping quiet. You don't need to intimidate 1,000 people if you've made sure each of those 1,000 people has something to lose: a career, a reputation, a relationship, a secret of their own. That's not a coincidence. That's architecture.
I believe that there are big realms of good and evil, and they're slugging it out.
What does the evil side want?
Oh, it wants you.
That's Mel Gibson. And before you dismiss it as religious drama, hold that thought. Because what Gibson is describing isn't theology. He's describing leverage. A person without an identity anchor, without a moral framework, without something they genuinely won't cross, that person can be owned. And the Epstein network ran entirely on owning people. Think about how Jeffrey Epstein actually operated. He didn't just collect secrets. He collected relationships. He dropped celebrity names constantly: DiCaprio, Blanchett, Bruce Willis, Cameron Diaz. Not because those people were necessarily involved, but because dropping those names made vulnerable young women believe he was legitimate, connected, safe, untouchable. The celebrity access was a weapon, and the celebrities whose silence he'd purchased became involuntary accomplices in the grooming process just by staying quiet. Harvey Weinstein ran the same playbook. Decades of assault protected by a web of NDAs, settlements, fixers, and a media industry that needed his access more than it needed its integrity. Journalists who got close to the story found their editors suddenly losing interest. Lawyers who took on his accusers found themselves buried in counter-litigation. Women who spoke up found their careers quietly torched. The machine didn't need to be coordinated from a single control room. The incentives were aligned. Everyone who benefited from the silence had a reason to maintain it. And Diddy, a federal investigation that's been building for years, while his name appeared at charity galas, award shows, and birthday parties for the most powerful people in music and entertainment. His events were networking opportunities. His access was currency. And the people who attended those events, who benefited from that access, who collected that currency, they had every reason in the world to look the other way. Do you see the pattern? It's not that these three men were protected because they were special. It's that they were protected because protecting them was in everyone else's interest. The system doesn't protect predators because it loves predators. It protects predators because predators are useful. They generate leverage. They generate access. They generate the kind of mutual compromise that makes everyone complicit, and therefore everyone silent.
Epstein Island isn't the only island out there.
Read that line again. Epstein Island isn't the only island out there. That wasn't an offhand comment. That was a man telling you the full scope of something he'd witnessed from the inside. Wahlberg wasn't talking about geography. He was talking about systems, plural. In 2023, Mark Wahlberg stood in front of hundreds of people at a Sunday service in Los Angeles and said things that should have made every entertainment journalist in America sprint to their keyboards. He said there was a war being waged against the entertainment industry's most powerful elite. He said predators had nowhere left to hide. He warned the room to expect disturbing news that would shake the foundations of the very industry that had made him a star. He was not wrong. The disturbing news arrived, on schedule, in volume. But here's the part that gets overlooked. Wahlberg didn't just predict what was coming. He described with surgical precision why it had been allowed to go on for so long. He talked about the culture of silence, the way speaking out about certain topics could end a career, the way the machine was designed to grind down anyone who refused to play by its rules. He had lived it personally, not as an observer, but as a participant who refused to fully participate. When Wahlberg decided to make Father Stu, a film about a boxer turned Catholic priest, he couldn't get a single major studio to touch it. They said faith-based films didn't sell. They said audiences weren't interested. They said it was too risky. And so Wahlberg did something almost unheard of for a man at his level of fame. He funded it himself. Poured his own money into a project that every gatekeeper in Hollywood told him was a mistake.
I just felt like it was so inspiring. The story needed to be told, and people now more than ever, we're all going through so much. People need this, and it's healing and it's comforting.
Now hold that up against what was happening inside the industry at the exact same time. Studios that wouldn't greenlight a film about a man finding God were still operating the party circuits, the private jet routes, the access networks that we now know were connected to the worst in entertainment history. The same industry that called faith-based storytelling too risky was, as a matter of documented fact, protecting men whose behavior made Wahlberg's most intense on-screen moments look like a nature documentary. He saw Jim Caviezel go through the same thing. When Caviezel made Sound of Freedom a film about the real-world operation to rescue children from trafficking networks, Hollywood didn't just pass on it. It actively buried it, refused to distribute it, refused to promote it, acted as if the film didn't exist. The same studios that will greenlight any amount of darkness, violence, and moral depravity suddenly had zero appetite for a story about rescuing children from predators. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself what it says about an industry when the story it least wants told is the one about protecting children.
Hollywood is evil.
Tell me why.
No, just listen. I love you.
Has it always been, or is it now?
Always.
Always. Not recently. Not since social media. Not since the culture changed. Always. That word carries weight. It means the protection networks for men like Epstein, Weinstein, and Diddy weren't a modern phenomenon. They weren't the result of some recent moral collapse. They were built in, from the beginning, into the structure itself. Now here's the part of this story that most people miss entirely, and it's the most important part, because everyone frames the faith element of Wahlberg and McConaughey's public statements as personal, as spiritual, as something separate from the Hollywood machine Epstein story. It's not separate, it's the same story. Think about what we know from the Epstein files. The network ran on leverage. It ran on having something on people. The whole architecture depended on a mutual compromise. You attend the party, you get on the plane, you sign the NDA, and now you're in. Now you're protected. Now you're untouchable. And now you're complicit. Mutual assured destruction as a business model. You cannot leverage what someone has already made public. You cannot blackmail someone who has already confessed their convictions to the world. Wait, that's narration from the transcript. Let me pull the actual clip. A Declaration of Independence. That's exactly what it was. And the industry understood it as a threat. Matthew McConaughey articulated his own version of this at the Oscars in 2014. He stood at that microphone in front of the most powerful room in entertainment, and he thanked God by name. Not the universe, not a higher power. God. And the camera cut away, and the silence was deafening.
First off, I want to thank God, because that's who I look up to. He's graced my life with opportunities that I know are not of my hand or any other human hand.
Dead silence in that room. One of the most acclaimed actors in the world, on the biggest night of his career, and the people who run his industry couldn't bring themselves to applaud when he named his creator. Because to that room, to the machine, a man who publicly names what he answers to is a man who has announced what he won't do. And in an industry that runs on getting people to do things they shouldn't, that announcement is not spiritual. It's political. It's structural. It's a problem.
We signed a contract to selling our souls. They got contracts out there that say you can't say Jesus.
Contractually prohibited, not frowned upon, not discouraged, written into legal agreements. Ask yourself what kind of industry puts a specific name in a contract's prohibited terms list. And then ask yourself what that tells you about why men like Epstein, Weinstein, and Diddy were able to operate so freely within it. February 2026. Attorney General Pam Bondi submits a list to Congress. Over 300 names, and the world stopped. Because this wasn't a Reddit thread. This wasn't a conspiracy forum. This was a government document. Verifiable, searchable, real, and suddenly every single warning that Wahlberg, McConaughey, Mel Gibson, Tyrese Gibson, and dozens of others had been dropping for years in interviews, in sermons, in the films they funded themselves, in the award show speeches that made rooms go quiet, stopped sounding like paranoia, and started sounding like testimony. There are people connected through financial arrangements, alleged blackmail, attempted collaborations, and there are people whose names appear because Epstein used them, dropped their names as grooming currency to make himself seem legitimate to victims.
I met him on that trip because it was his plane. I didn't know who plane we was getting on, but it was a whole bunch of dignitary people who was with a delegation.
That's Chris Tucker, describing a trip he took that turned out to be on Epstein's aircraft. He didn't know, and that's precisely the point. The network was designed so that you could be pulled in without knowing you'd been pulled in. And once you were in, once your name was in a log, once your face was in a photograph, once you'd attended a dinner or a gathering connected to that world, you had something to lose. And the machine knew it. This is how the protection worked. This is the answer to the question everyone keeps asking: how did they get away with it for so long? It wasn't that the powerful looked the other way out of indifference. It's that enough of them had been woven into the fabric of access and compromise that speaking out would have meant pulling threads that unraveled their own stories too.
The ritualistic behaviors, the drugging, putting girls in the suitcases, dumping them in alleyways. It's horrifying. And it's all done under the protection of this is going to be paid off. There's another NDA.
They're under the protection of money, of silence, of an industry that rewards compliance and destroys dissent. That's not a metaphor. That's a documented operational system, and Wahlberg watched it run in real time for decades. Let's talk about what happens when you don't play along. Because Wahlberg isn't the only data point here. Mel Gibson went from being one of the most commercially successful directors in Hollywood history, the man behind Braveheart, the man who made The Passion of the Christ at his own expense because studios refused to fund it, to being systematically destroyed. The official story was the 2006 DUI incident. And yes, he said things in that moment that he has acknowledged and apologized for. But here's the timeline that matters. The industry's normal protocol for its golden assets is quiet rehabilitation. You manage the PR cycle, you give the person a path back, you protect the investment. Hollywood has done it for far worse. But for Gibson, the industry went scorched earth, permanent, total. And years later, he became one of the loudest public supporters of Sound of Freedom, a film about child trafficking that Hollywood had done everything in its power to bury. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. The industry doesn't just ignore truth tellers. It destroys them preemptively. It finds the lever the scandal, the bad night, the out-of-context quote, and it pulls it hard, so that when that person eventually starts talking about what they know, they've already been discredited.
Bigger things at play here. And institutions that purport to touch on the divine are necessarily going to be affected by that slugfest that's going on between good and evil.
Right.
And
sometimes good gives up ground.
That line, say it slowly. Sometimes good gives up ground, because that is exactly what happened over the decades that Epstein, Weinstein, and Diddy operated. The people with platforms, with audiences, with the ability to say something true to millions of people, they stayed quiet. They attended the right parties. They kept the right secrets. They signed the right documents. Good gave up ground, inch by inch, deal by deal, silence by silence, except for the ones who didn't. The files are open now. Millions of pages, thousands of names, flight logs, emails, photographs, depositions from women who were recruited at modeling auditions by a man who used celebrity access as bait. The mountain of evidence has been decades in the making, and it is now in the public domain. Undeniable, documented, real, and yet new arrests have not followed at the scale the evidence demands. The powerful remain largely free. The system that protected Epstein for decades is still operational. The same structural incentives, the access networks, the mutual compromise, the weaponized silence, they didn't evaporate when the files were released. Systems don't end with document dumps. They end with accountability. And accountability requires people who are willing to name what they know publicly, regardless of the cost. Which brings us back to the beginning, because Mark Wahlberg issued this warning not with a press release, not with a tweet, not with a dramatic interview timed to a news cycle. He issued it with his career choices, with his money, with the roles he turned down and the films he funded himself, and the sermons he gave and the Sunday school meetings where he told a room full of people that predators were running out of places to hide.
Things that I want to share that with people, and I certainly want to help kids avoid making the same mistakes that I made when I was younger.
He said that on camera to millions of people. A man who has seen the machine from the inside, watched it protect the powerful and silence the vulnerable, and chose at real personal and financial cost to do the opposite. To be the person who said no. To be the person who publicly, visibly, loudly anchored himself to something the machine couldn't purchase. Because here's the thing about Epstein's network. Weinstein's empire and Diddy's operation that connects them all in a single thread. None of them could have operated without the silence of people who knew better. The leverage only works on people with secrets. The blackmail only functions if the targets have something they're trying to hide. The whole architecture of protection depends on a world where everyone is compromised enough that speaking out costs more than staying silent. A man who has nothing to hide and everything already on the record is the one person that architecture cannot touch.
Do not deny my faith. That's an even bigger sin.
That wasn't just a spiritual statement. That was a man telling the most powerful industry in the world, I see you. I know what you're protecting. I know why you protect it, and I am not available for purchase. Mark Wahlberg warned you this was coming. He said predators had nowhere left to hide. He said the truth would come out. He was mocked for it. His career suffered for it. He paid a real price for being willing to say out loud what everyone inside the machine already knew. The question now is not whether he was right. The question is whether this moment of exposure leads to actual accountability, or whether it becomes another cycle of outrage that the machine waits out, like it has waited out every other cycle, until the cameras move on and the silence is rebuilt from scratch. That's the question, and the answer, whatever it turns out to be, is going to tell us everything about what Hollywood actually learned. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this video opened your eyes to something you hadn't fully connected before, share it. Because the truth, whatever is still left of it, is waiting to be told.